Dakota Territory winter of 1882. The prairie lay silent under a sheet of white that stretched so far the horizon dissolved into the sky. The wind moved first, long before the sun, slipping over the frozen ground with the low, hollow sound of timber bending in deep cold. Nothing stood between Manitoba and the distant Missouri but grass, snow, and the stubborn decisions of the men who tried to settle this place. Across that endless plain, most had vanished into drifts piled up to their window sills. Roof lines sagged beneath the weight of storms that came too early and too often. Doors stuck, floors froze, families burned through their woodpiles faster than they dared admit. But one structure refused to disappear. It rose in two distinct tiers, unlike anything else in the valley. The upper story projected full 2 feet beyond the lower walls, forming dark ring of shadow around the entire foundation. Snow that other homes never reached the base of this one. The wind carved around it as though the house itself bent the weather to its will. This was the cabin of Elias Crowe. Only a few months earlier it had been the joke of the settlement. Too tall, too strange, too heavy on top. The American-born carpenters laughed at it from the moment his frame went up, shaking their heads at what they called wasted good timber. They said he didn't know the first thing about building on the plains. They said no man from across the ocean understood Dakota wind. But now, in the heart of winter, colder than anyone had expected, their own houses sat half-buried, half-frozen, while Crows stood dry, warm, and untouched. Inside those ordinary cabins, frost crept along the log walls 3 feet from the stove. Children slept with scarves wrapped over their faces to stop their breath from freezing on their blankets. A man could hold his hand to the floorboards and feel the cold radiating upward like something alive. Yet in the Crow cabin, the floor stayed warm enough that the child could walk barefoot without flinching. His firewood pile barely seemed to shrink, and no matter how fierce the streamed across the valley, his foundation logs remained bone-dry. Protected by design, everyone had ridiculed. The valley had begun whispering the same question from one homestead to the next, spoken quietly around lanterns as if the winter itself might be listening. What did Elias Crowe know that the rest of them had missed? Elias Crowe did not come to Dakota as a blank slate. He arrived carrying the weight of mountains far older and harsher than the prairie, shaped by it, a landscape where winter was not a season but a force that sculpted the lives of everyone who lived beneath it. He was born in the upland valleys of southern Norway, in a village tucked between steep pine-covered ridges and slow-moving streams that froze solid every year. By early October, his earliest memories were of his father's tools biting into spruce beams, the scent of fresh-cut pine sap, and the groaning weight of snow sliding off roofs built to survive storms that could bury barn in single night. He learned young that wood does not fear cold, it fears water. His father repeated that line as he taught Elias to build the traditional stabber. Those raised storehouses perched on stone piers with upper floors that jutted out like protective balconies. These overhangs kept meat dry, grain safe, and foundations untouched by the wet seasons. Elias watched spring snowmelt spill from roofs, hit the projecting upper walls, and leap outward, landing well away from the building's base. He saw how the driest logs lasted 60 years, while those touched by only single wet season began to soften and darken. It was simple geometry, but on the frontier, simple lessons often matter most. By his early 20s, Elias had rebuilt 3-stabber, repair storm-damaged farmhouse, and crafted the joinery for mountain hut meant to withstand fierce crosswinds off the North Sea. His skill grew, but his village shrank. Failed harvests tested every family. Cold summers hardened the ground before roots could take hold. Hunger, not ambition, became the reason young men boarded ships for America. When Elias left in 1879, he carried only the tools he trusted: a broad axe, a framing square, a hand-forged auger, and a leather-bound sketchbook filled with measurements and drawings of buildings designed to rise above moisture and endure the long Norwegian winters. He traveled with one conviction: if he was to build a new life, he would build it the right way, even if no one else understood why. The Dakota Territory greeted him with a horizon and anything he had ever imagined. No mountains, no fjords, no shelter except the cottonwoods along the creeks. But to Elias, everything the locals saw as hardship looked strangely familiar. The wind that raced uninterrupted across hundreds of miles reminded him of storms funneled down narrow valleys back home. The heavy drifts piling against fences mimicked the way snow stacked along rock walls in Telemark. Even the biting dryness of the cold felt like something he had known since childhood. He walked his claim, the quarter section he purchased 8 miles northwest of Fargo, over and over, studying it at sunrise, at dusk, during early storms, and during the warm Chinook days that softened the prairie just long enough to expose how water traveled. He noted where the first melt gathered, where the earth held sogginess longer, where the wind carved ridges of snow, and where it swept the ground clean. While his neighbors saw blank prairie, Elias saw blueprint. He understood something most of them did not. The frontier was not a place to rush, a place to read, and in that reading he recognized all the same threats he had known since childhood. Moisture rising from thawing ground, snow drifting into corners, and low eaves that trapped meltwater against wood. Only here the scale was larger, the wind fiercer, and the consequences harsher. His house would have to be different. Not larger, not fancier, simply smarter. So when summer came and other settlers raced to build before winter returned, Elias took out his old Norwegian sketchbook and began adapting those familiar stabber principles to new world of vast plains and relentless storms. What he designed would look nothing like typical American frontier cabin. Decision in the eyes of his neighbors marked the moment he crossed from newcomer to fool. But to Elias Crowe was the only way he knew how to build something meant to last. By midsummer, the settlers around Elias had already raised their cabins. They worked with the urgency of people who believed every swing of the axe brought them one step further from winter's reach. Their homes were simple rectangles, 16 by 20 feet, framed and notched in long weekends, chinked hastily with prairie clay and grass, and roofed with modest eaves no longer than a man's outstretched hand. Speed was the virtue of the American frontier. Build quickly, cheaply, survive the first winter, and worry about repairs later. Elias didn't share that urgency. He spent his evenings pacing the edges of his claim, marking how shadows fell in late summer, how the wind curled around clumps of bluestem, and how early storms might strike his ridge line. His neighbors measured progress by the height of their walls. Elias measured his by the shifting patterns of the land. To the settlers who passed by with wagons full of lumber and supplies, like hesitation, wasteful hesitation, the murmurs started small. Strange fellow, that Crow. Still hasn't laid his sill logs. What's he waiting for? Foreign builders don't understand this country. No one disapproved more openly than Jedediah Pike, local carpenter who had frame barns and depots along the northern Pacific line. Jed had confidence sharpened by years of building fast and getting paid for it. When he saw Elias take his measurements again and again, setting stakes not once but 3 times, he spat into the dust and shook his head. Man's overthinking dirt. He told anyone near enough. Here, you put your house where it stands dry and hope the wind behaves. There's nothing else to it. But dry was a matter of months. Elias was thinking in decades. By late August, while neighboring families gathered firewood and harvested early crops, he finally marked out the footprint of his house, 18 by 24 feet on the ground, bigger than most, but not excessively so. It wasn't the size that drew attention. It was the next decision. He set his stakes again. 4 feet beyond the perimeter of his ground floor, Jed Pike watched from atop wagon load of timber, squinting against the sun. What's he doing now? Elias drove another stake, then another, forming second larger rectangle in the dusty grass, 22 by 28 feet, full 2 feet wider in every direction than the lower floor he had just marked. When Jed realized what he was seeing, he let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He's building the second story bigger than the first. House wearing hat 2 sizes too big. He repeated the joke at the general store that evening, and the valley repeated it for days. Neighbors slowed their horses when passing Elias's claim, staring at the strange configuration of stakes and string. Some shook their heads in quiet disbelief. Others simply pitied the man who, in their eyes, didn't understand the first rule of prairie building. Keep your weight low, keep your lines straight, keep your timbers even. But Elias ignored every whisper. He had seen too many homes back in Norway decay from the bottom up. He knew snow didn't simply fall. It piled, melted, frozen, crept into the wood grain like rot wearing winter coat, and he knew the cabin he built here would face those same forces, magnified by the sheer violence of the Dakota wind. Still, to the valley it was the first clear sign that Elias Crowe was not just different. He was unconventional in a way that made people uneasy. The prairie was a place where survival depended on conformity, on doing what the next man did, because the next man had survived long enough to teach you. To depart from that unwritten rule was to invite suspicion. Elias didn't notice, or perhaps he noticed everything and simply didn't care. Either way, the stakes were in the ground, and the cabin he would build there would soon challenge everything the prairie thought it understood about winter. When September arrived and the prairie grass turned brittle under the first light frost, most settlers in the valley had already sealed their roofs and stacked their firewood. Elias Crowe was only just beginning. The ground floor footprint of his cabin rose slowly, slower than anyone expected from men working against northern winter. The first logs he set down were not chosen for convenience but for longevity. He selected pine trunks nearly 12 inches thick, thrived with careful strokes of his knife until the fit between them closed tight enough to stop draft without lick of chinking. Every joint felt deliberate, as though he was building something intended not just for one lifetime, but for the next. Most cabins here were raised in rush, shaped by hands that hurried to beat the cold. Elias's hands did not hurry. They carved, tested, revised. He spent half morning trimming the corner notch of single-sill log, working it again and again until it rested against its partner with the soft lock of puzzle piece sliding home. Neighbors watching. Distance shook their heads. He'll be building till Christmas. He cares more for perfect corners than for staying warm. But Elias knew where perfection mattered. Cold would not destroy lugs. Water would. And sloppy joint, even one hidden beneath the snow, could hold enough meltwater come spring to begin the slow, certain work of rot. By early September, the first story stood 8 feet high. Clean, solid, square. But the real spectacle began when Elias raised beams for his second floor, but these were not the modest timbers common on the frontier. They were 8 by 8 inch joists, each one hewn straight, polished flat along its top edge, and stretched 4 feet into the structure beyond the overhang they were meant to support. To the men who gathered near the fence line and pretended not to stare, it looked reckless, foolhardy. The prairie wind didn't give second chances to heavy structures balanced on small footprints. Jedediah Pike, ever the loudest, rode over one afternoon with his coat flapping in the wind, dismounted, pointed at the massive beams jutting from the half-built frame, and declared loud enough for nearby homesteads to hear, "That top floor will walk itself straight to Minnesota the first time the wind hits it." Elias didn't answer. He simply set another joist on his shoulder, carried it to the frame, and guided it into place with slow, careful movements. He locked each beam with hardwood peg driven through hand-drilled holes. No nails, no shortcuts. Old-world joinery meant to withstand storms older than anything Dakota could throw at him. As the second-story walls rose, their shape startled visitors even more. The upper floor stretched 22 by 28 feet. Fully 2 feet larger than the lower walls on every side, it cast deep perimeter of shadow onto the ground as though the house were lifting its own weight off the earth. Children who passed with their families stared wide-eyed at the strange house, whispering that it looked like garrison tower or watch post meant for fort, not farmstead. Adults whispered too, but their tone carried skepticism instead of wonder. Too much house on top. He's wasting timber nobody can afford. It'll tear itself apart in order. But Elias had reason for every board, every angle, every hour spent sharpening tools instead of raising walls. He had grown up watching steep Scandinavian roofs shed avalanches of snow that would have crushed shallow pitch. He had seen meltwater ruin so logs that had borne families through generations. And he had learned again and again that house must be designed for the storm you don't see coming. So he built his roof, steeper than any around him, 10/12 pitch that seemed almost defiant against the sky. He extended the eaves 3 feet beyond the upper walls, and with every piece fitted into place, the building grew more startling, more impossible to the vowel's eye. By the time October wind swept across the prairie, Elias's neighbors were bundling their children indoors, sealing cracks with mud, and praying their firewood would carry him through the coming months. Elias stood beneath the dark ring of shadow cast by his overhanging second story and ran his hand along the dry sill logs of his foundation. Nothing touched them, no snow, no wind-driven drift, no moisture at all. He had built precisely what he intended. Cabin that lifted its vulnerable heart out of winter's reach. Whether the valley would ever understand why it would depend entirely on the winter heading their way. By the time Elias Crowe drove the last hardwood peg into place, his neighbors had already settled into their winter routines, sealing windows with rags, banking the first drifts of snow against their walls, and stacking whatever firewood they could afford to spare. They still didn't understand why he had built his house the way he did, but they would soon feel the consequences of their own designs, and the principles behind his cabin were older than any map of Dakota territory. They came from winters where the sea froze for months and where single mistaken building meant rebuilding the entire structure the next spring. Back in Norway, Elias had learned that snow didn't simply rest against house. It pressed, thawed, froze again, and held moisture tight against the weakest logs. Snowbank could insulate for season, but it carried silent cost, water that crept into sills, darkening the wood grain, softening fibers, and beginning this certain work of decay. Frontier manuals in America still praise snowbanking as free insulation. Elias knew better. Cold never frightened well-built cabin. Water did. The most important weapon against water was distance. Physical gap between the falling snow and the vulnerable foundation. Elias achieved that with geometry, not guesswork. He began with steep roof, pitch 10/12, shaped like the prow of longship cutting through heavy seas. Snow could linger on slope that sharp. The moment weight built up, it slid off in sheets. When it did, the real genius of his design came into play. The roof eaves stretched 3 full feet beyond the upper walls. The upper walls stretched 2 feet beyond the lower ones. Together they formed a 5-foot projection. Wooden shield that forced snow and melt water far from the foundation. Every avalanche that tumbled from the roof struck the overhanging second floor, broke into spray of powder, and fell in graceful arc that landed well outside the footprint of the house. Where other settlers had drifts pressed hard against their walls, Elias had ring of clear earth circling his cabin. Dry moat carved not by shovels, but by physics. The second force working in his favor was the wind itself. Most men saw the Dakota wind as destroyer. Elias saw it. The overhanging floor created wind shadow, low pressure pocket beneath the projection. As the wind raced across the prairie and struck his cabin, it curled downward and then slipped outward again, unable to drop its burden of snow directly at his foundation. Drifts formed farther out where they could do no harm. Beneath the overhang, the ground stayed visible even in the worst storms. The settlers who laughed at his top-heavy house couldn't see the simple truth. The upper story acted like vast umbrella, catching the violent forces of winter and redirecting them away from the logs that mattered most. The science behind it wasn't complex. Dry wood holds heat, wet wood loses it. On freezing night, moisture soaks a log could pull warmth from cabin floor the same way ice pulls heat from bare skin. That was why so many frontier families complained that their floors never warmed, no matter how fiercely the stove burned. Their walls were in contact with frozen soaked wood, silent thieves of heat. But in Elias Crowe's cabin, the foundation remained elevated, shelter untouched. His sill logs stayed dry and dense, locking in warmth instead of leaking it to the winter. The temperature difference would eventually prove dramatic, 25 to 29 degrees warmer near the floor. Even with a smaller fire burning, there was a third advantage too, one his neighbors hadn't considered until it was too late. Most roofs on the frontier carried snow. Elias's roof refused to hold any. His steep pitch and smooth joinery prevented danger. Accumulation, sparing his cabin the crushing pressure that bowed rafters and cracked joints on simpler structures. Every storm cleared itself from his roof before weight could threaten the frame. Inside, his heavy joists, 8 inches square and anchored 4 feet deep into the structure, spread the load evenly through the inner posts. Where others heard the groaning of timber under stress, Elias's house remained silent and steady. The overhang was not whim, not flourish, not an eccentricity. It was solution born from lifetime of studying snow, wind, thought, and the way winter shapes everything it touches. Most people built cabins as though they were building for the weeks ahead. Elias built storms no one had yet imagined. The valley still didn't understand what he had done, but winter was coming and winter understood perfectly. The first real storm arrived earlier than anyone expected. On the night of November 18th, a gray wall formed along the northern horizon. Quiet, shapeless, and far too wide to outrun. By morning, the Dakota prairie disappeared beneath sheet of driven snow, and the wind began its long assault on every roof, every fence line, every homestead standing in its path. Settlers who had lived here for years swore they had never felt storm like it so early. Season, the drifts rose waist deep in single day, sculpted by winds that roared down from Manitoba with nothing to slow them. Snow slammed against walls so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown from the dark. By nightfall, most cabins were buried halfway to the windows. Elias Crowe's cabin was not, while his neighbors fought to keep pathways open and doors unblocked. The steep roof of Elias's house shed snow as quickly as it fell. Sheets of powders down the slope broke against the overhanging second story and flared outward in wide arc that settled 4 to 6 feet away from the base of the building. Around the entire perimeter of the cabin, clear ring remained. Bare earth under the deep shadow of the overhang. To the families struggling in ordinary homes, it looked almost unnatural. Inside those regular cabins, the cost of their choices became painfully clear. Snow that had banked against their outer walls began re-solid, pressing against logs that swelled with trapped moisture. The cold traveled inward, following the wet fibers like wick. Floors turned icy beneath blankets and straw mats. Men could spill a cup of water beside the hearth and find it frozen by morning. They burned wood faster than they wanted to admit, cords disappearing one after another just to keep the frost from creeping across their walls. Jedediah Pike's cabin suffered most of all. His roof pitched shallow to save lumber, gathered heavy burden after each storm. Rafters groaned beneath the load. Hairline cracks began to appear along the ceiling boards. On more than one night, Jed lay awake listening to the frame above him, wondering if the next gust of wind would bring the whole structure down around his family. But in the Crowe cabin, the atmosphere was entirely different. The stove glowed steadily, not furiously. The warmth reached to every corner. The floorboards near the outer wall stayed above 40 degrees on the coldest nights. Luxury few frontier homes could ever claim. The dry sill logs, untouched by so held their heat instead of surrendering it to frozen ground. Elias burned only a modest pile of split oak while the valley consumed 4 to 5 cords before midwinter. No one could miss the contrast. By late December, another storm struck. Worse than the first. The wind screamed across the open land with sound like tearing canvas. Snow drifted chest-high against any obstacle it found. Jed Pike's cabin vanished halfway to the eaves beneath single night. White families shoveled through the dark to free their doorways. Parents carried their children to the lofts to escape the bitter cold rolling across the floors. Neighbors traded hours of chopping, stacking, patching, and praying. Meanwhile, Elias stood beneath the shelter of his overhang, brush and light dusting of snow from his coat. Not single drift touched his foundation. The wind that ravaged every other home in the valley curled harmlessly around the projecting upper story, dropping its load farther out where the snow deepened in harmless piles against the taller grasses. Even those who disliked him could not deny what their eyes saw. January tested the valley harder. Storm after storm moved across the plains. 8 in total between New Year's and the first thaw. During one particularly violent blizzard, wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour struck the settlement. Jed Pike heard something snap in his roof frame, sharp crack like rifle shot. He rushed to brace the failing rafter with post he tore from his own porch. That same night, Elias walked the perimeter of his house, lantern in hand, inspecting the joinery. His frame didn't shift, his joists didn't flex. Interior posts swallowed the force of every gust. The steep roof never held enough snow to threaten the rafters. Inside, his family slept through the storm. By midwinter, the difference had become impossible to ignore. The settlers spoke of it in hushed tones at the small church gatherings, wondering aloud how the strange Norwegian design could outperform every tried and true American cabin they had built for decades. The truth stared them in the face every time they stepped outside. Their homes were fighting the winter. Elias's home had been built to redirect it, and the season was not yet finished showing them the full price of their choices. By March, the storms had quieted, but the prairie did not soften immediately. Winter held on with long, skeletal fingers, clinging to the land through nights that still dipped below freezing. Then, almost overnight, the thaw arrived. Slow sucking creep rather than a sudden release, the kind of thaw every frontier builder feared more than any blizzard. The snowbanks around most cabins, piled high for months, did not melt cleanly. They sagged, they slumped. They turned from into dense, gray mass of saturated ice and water. The top softened each afternoon under pale sun, dripping meltwater down into the deeper layers where it collected against log walls that had been buried since December. Settlers stepped outside expecting relief. Instead, they found trouble. The thaw revealed stains along the base of nearly every cabin. Dark horizontal bands 6 to 8 inches above the soil line where moisture had seeped into pine fibers. And there, logs that had felt solid last year now yielded under a thumbnail. Knife blade could dig in half an inch with frightening ease. Brown rot had begun its quiet work during the long freeze, feeding on trapped moisture where sunlight never reached. Jedediah Pike was among the first to notice something was wrong. One morning his front door refused to close. He thought it was swollen hinges. Then he looked closer. The sill log beneath the threshold had softened. Once dense and pale, now carried bruised, spongy texture. Moisture had crept upward from the frozen slush packed against the cabin's north wall. The log had begun to sag under its own weight, pulling the entire frame out of square. He tested it with an awl. The tool sank disturbingly deep. "You've got to be joking," he muttered to himself, feeling something in his chest tighten. He had spent the winter praising the snowbanks for their insulation. Now the same snow had become the slow poison eating through the foundation he depended on. Neighbors fared no better. Cabins that had looked stout back in October now sat atop topsoil that squished underfoot long into April. Moisture lingered in the earth within 3 feet of the walls. Dark, cold, and saturated. Every rainstorm added to the load. Every overnight freeze locked more water into the log fibers. What had begun as winter comfort had become spring calamity. Then there was Elias Crowe's cabin. The thaw revealed no stains on his sill logs, no soft patches, no sagging frame. The ground beneath his overhang remained firm and dry, the soil barely darker than it had been in the fall. Visitor could kneel and see that not single drift had ever touched the foundation. Meltwater had always fallen 5 from the base exactly as Elias had intended. Moisture had never gained foothold. When Jed Pike finally swallowed his pride enough to visit, he brought his own awl. He tested Elias's south sill first. The steel tip barely scratched the surface. He tried again, pressing harder. The awl slipped, glancing off the dense, untouched grain. Jed stood slowly and let out breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. How in blazes? Elias didn't answer immediately. He simply crouched beside the foundation, brushing aside few stray needles of grass. The earth was dry beneath his fingertips. "Snow is friend until spring," he said at last. "After that it remembers what it is, water, and water does not forgive." Word spread quickly. Families who had mocked the foreign Garrison House now faced expensive repairs. Replacing sill log meant jacking up the entire building. task few settlers could afford in money or manpower. Children carried buckets of slush away from softened foundation walls, trying desperately to protect what little structural integrity remained. By late April, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Out of the entire valley, only one cabin stood without stains or structural wounds. The strange, top-heavy house that had been the subject of so much gossip in the fall. The thaw had revealed what the storms had only hinted at. Elias Crowe had built cabin that defied winter. He had built one that defied spring. And for the first time since the day he drove his stakes into the prairie sod, the valley began to understand that his overhang wasn't excess, it was foresight. Judgment, memory of land that had already taught him these lessons long before he came to the frontier. The prairie would teach them now, too, whether they wanted the lesson or not. As the valley worked through the long, wet spring, people began stopping by Elias Crowe's homestead more often. Not to gawk at the strange cabin as they once had, but to ask questions they were no longer too proud to ask. They found him splitting wood, repairing tool handle, or walking the perimeter of his land with that quiet, thoughtful pace he carried everywhere. And when they asked how he had known what to build, Elias rarely spoke about technique first. He spoke about time most folks build for the winter they remember, he would say. But the winter that matters is the one you've never seen. To him, survival wasn't an act of strength. It was an act of patience, of studying the land long enough to understand what it demanded. He had grown up where storms carved their lessons into cedar and spruce, where man learned early that shortcuts were simply debts he would have to pay later with interest. The settlers in Dakota were learning that same truth. Now, Elias believed cabin wasn't just shelter, it was philosophy expressed in timber and stone. You built the foundation higher than you thought necessary because moisture rose farther than you expected. You extended the eaves wider than the day's weather required because tomorrow's weather might test you differently. You measured twice not because the board demanded it, but because the land did. The people who visited him in those months noticed that Elias rarely spoke in terms of fear. He wasn't afraid of storms. He respected them. He respected snow, thaw, wind, and every force that shaped prairie life. Respect he believed was more reliable than hope. Hope can't keep the log dry, he said once, half smiling as he set beam against sawers. But thoughtful overhang can. As word spread, the valley began repeating his sayings. Simple lines that carried the weight of experience. Wet log steals more heat than a cold one. Build for the thaw, not the freeze. Winter tests your walls. Spring tests your judgment. His neighbors found themselves thinking differently when they examined their own cabins. Instead of asking how quickly they could build, they began asking how long something would last. Instead of wondering how save timber, they wondered how much timber mistake might eventually cost. Elias Crowe never preached these lessons. He lived them. The strength of his cabin was not its size or its bold profile. It was the mindset behind it, mindset shaped by old world winters and sharpened by new world challenges. In land where most men reacted to the environment, Elias studied it. Where others built fast, he built wise. And where others trusted tradition, he trusted observation. The settlement would remember his cabin not just for how it endured the snow winter, but for what it taught them afterward. That survival on the frontier was not merely a matter of strength or luck, but of humility, of recognizing that the land always has the final say, and the men who listened to that truth would outlast those who ignored it. By the time a decade had passed, the cabins scattered across the Dakota prairie no longer looked the way they once did. The simple, short-cheap boxes that settlers had thrown together during the rush of the early 1880s had begun to disappear, some collapsing under their own fatigue, others repaired so often their original logs could barely be recognized. But the houses built after the snow winter told a different story. New homesteaders arriving from the east noticed that cabins bore wide, thoughtful eaves, 18 to even 24 inches. Foundations stood higher above grade. Sill logs were lifted on stone piers or protected by deeper shadows. Some families experimented with modest overhangs of their own, pushing their upper floors outward foot or more in quiet imitation of the strange Norwegian structure that had startled the valley years before. And every one of these choices could be traced back to Elias Crowe. The transformation was slow, almost invisible. First, it happened not because anyone meant to follow him, but because the evidence stood plainly in front of him each spring. When the thaw came, the houses with long eaves stayed drier. When the storms rolled in, the cabins lifted slightly off the ground, weathered the wind better. When snow melted away, the structures designed with moisture in mind needed fewer repairs. Even the most stubborn settlers came to accept what they once resisted. No one talked openly about the season when Jedediah Pike nearly lost his roof, or when families had shoveled slush away from softened walls for weeks. But everyone remembered it, and everyone understood quietly that it had been Elias's cabin, not their own, that endured the worst of it without bending, without groaning, without losing so much as a single inch of its integrity. By 1892, a visitor riding through the valley would have noticed something peculiar. Many newer homes carried the unmistakable influence of Scandinavian hand. Roof lines were steeper, designed to shed snow rather than cradle it. Eaves reached farther out. Builders spoke of log moisture the way farmers spoke of soil quality. The conversation had changed. Word of Elias's design even reached the county assessor, who traveled each autumn to record the conditions of homesteads for taxation. He noted with craftsman's eye that the cabins built with generous overhangs retained their value far longer than those built in the frantic years of settlement. Foundations stayed sound, walls stayed true. Repairs came less often and cost less when they did. It became common, almost expected, for new arrivals to ask where the Crowe house stood. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect. Few came because they were tired of losing logs to rot and wanted to see with their own eyes structure that seemed immune to the valley's worst weather. They found home that looked almost exactly as it had the day it was built. The overhang remained strong. The sill logs remained dry. The walls stood straight against the prairie wind. Time had not humbled it. Time had affirmed it. Elias Crowe himself grew older, his beard silvering, his pace flat, into the steady gait of a man who had worked with his hands for a lifetime. But whenever he looked at the newer houses along the road, that the extended eaves, the elevated foundations, the smarter geometry, he recognized something familiar. The valley had not adopted his exact design. A few cabins were bold enough to carry a full 2-foot overhang, but the principles had spread quietly and thoroughly. Long-term thinking, protection over speed, respect for moisture, when in the slow logic of the land. He never claimed credit. He never asked for it. The prairie was not a place where men advertised their wisdom. It was a place where wisdom either worked or failed, where winter delivered the final verdict. But for those who understood the story, the truth was simple. Elias Crowe had not just built a cabin, he had rebuilt a mindset. In a land where settlers once raced through construction as fast as their axes could swing, the valley now built with patience, with intention, with an understanding that survival was not earned in a single season but across decades. And as the sun set behind his overhanging walls, casting the same protective ring of shadow that had guarded his foundation since the day it was laid, Elias knew that the lesson would outlast him, not the shape of the house, but the wisdom behind it. Build for the storm you haven't met yet. Build for the thaw. Build for the future. The prairie remembers those who do.